All right, well, we'll get started here. So my name is Dr. Russ McCullough with the Gortney Institute here at Ottawa University. And we are doing a joint venture with the Pearson-Eby Liberty Academy. And this happens to be my class tonight, and this is some of the topics that we do. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to join this talk with my class. So thank you, class. We have other stuff to get into after this is complete, once we get done. So on the table and on some of your sheets there, you can earn a Pearson-Eby Liberty Academy certificate. So this is the fifth in the lecture series of 9. So this is number 5. And so by doing a short reflection paper, I'm the one who's grading them, so I don't want it to be real long. So, I mean, it's meant to be easy, but for you to reflect on the topic of the night. And so the whole course is centered on why freedom. We have a lot of politicians that get into office and they talk about maybe promoting business or economic freedom or whatever, human freedoms. But then they get into the murkiness of politics and they get lost because they're not grounded in some principles that we have here at Ottawa University through various coursework and other things. So we custom made this curriculum with this is kind of is it fair to call it a subsidiary of some sort of the Kansas Policy Institute. So James Franco is here, he'll speak later. And so that is the format. And so I'm going to talk about economic freedom for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to just do Q&A. So we'll wrap up by 7:30 sharp, no later than that for sure. And so we'll see what happens, and we'll see how we can get you thinking about freedom and what that means in an economic sense. So my background, I'm kind of a real estate guy actually, but I went to Iowa State University, got my PhD in economics there. Public policy and public economics, and been at Ottawa now for 15 years. So I hold the Wayne Angell Chair of Economics. Wayne Angell was a special guy here from Ottawa that served on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, among many other things. He just recently passed away. One of his students was Jim Gortney, and that's who we named the institute after. He also just passed away here recently. So we have a long legacy of some great thinkers here at Ottawa, and hope to continue that on for many years here at Ottawa as well. All right, so economic freedom. Well, this is a shameless plug for our weekly Faith and Economics podcast. Our professor team, we have a professor that actually just left for another venture. He's still an affiliate scholar with us, Dr. Peter Jacobson. He's an economist. And then we have our philosophy professor, Dr. Justin Clark. And so the three of us do weekly podcast. We talk about all kinds of things. And so it's a lot of fun. You can go through and see if there's a topic that you might like to take a listen. We have a good time with that and sometimes have special guests as well. Okay, so here it is. This was according to Jim Gortney. Individuals with economic freedom have it when property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft, right? So you have property that you acquired in a fair way of some sort. So you're able to do that, and it's protected from physical invasions by others. You're free to use it, exchange it, give it, throw it away, trash it, as long as whatever you do with it does not violate the identical rights of others. So kind of a nice, simple working definition. There's some other things that we'll get into later, but I've always liked that one to think about what freedom is to be able to own property, right? In other places and other governments, the government controls more of your life. And so in a place where the government has less in your life, it's really a spectrum. There's no place that really has no government in your life, right? Where we're always having something out there, even if it's social norms during a place where, like in the Congo, where there's anarchy or something. You have some things, some rules or restrictions, usually some institutions that are in place. Okay, so in order to get a high economic freedom ranking, we're going to be thinking tonight we're going to go through country-wide analysis just to kind of get our feeling of why it's important and what it looks like around the world. And then ultimately I'm going to bring it to the United States and talk about Kansas and its place. So it can be shown in a number of different ways. Okay, so 5 areas. To get a high ranking, you must keep your government spending and taxes low. Why is that? Well, we're trying to measure individual economic freedom. And so if you think about getting a paycheck for $1,000, and you live in a country that has a 20% tax rate. Oops, I'm not doing my math here. You get $800 left over. In another country that has a 30% tax rate, then you pay $300 and you have $700 left over. So a country that leaves you more empowered with the income that you earn to choose what to do, we're driving choices down to the individual level. In that country, you have more economic freedom, or that's one of the aspects of it, right? So now it doesn't always work to have like no taxes or too low a taxes. There's kind of dysfunctioning countries where maybe there is some need for taxes. So I'm not trying to drive it to zero. Zero is not the optimal. But nonetheless, in general, that's one of the metrics that you'll see is used here on how much a fraction of the government is in your life with your paychecks. Access to sound money. So we had a good dose of this. I didn't even think we were ever going to do this. I mean, I graduated high school in 1989 and started undergrad, and I thought, oh, we talked about the inflation of the 70s where we got up to 10% inflation, and it was always this historical look back, and as I taught it in macroeconomics, students would kind of look like, well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean nothing to me, because we always enjoyed 2 to 3% inflation for a 30-year run, right? Even 40-year run, pretty much. And then COVID, and then stupid government policy. Despite what they say, it's not greedy corporate America and other things. It's very simple. The central bank ran the printing press to offset some of the government spending that they did for the COVID, I call them the COVID bonds. The money supply went up, inflation followed. That story does not get told very often, but that is the math of it. That is the economics. When we have too much money chasing too few goods, it's like I said, something I used to talk about in the 70s, which fell on sometimes deaf ears with students because what does it mean? But now we know what it means, don't we? We know that egg prices are 15 to 20% higher than what they were 4 years ago, right? When we accumulate the inflation over time. Prices aren't going down, we're never getting back. So when they say inflation is down now, they're trying to bring it down from 5% to 3%, but it's still a positive 3%. So if something was $10, it's now $10.30 next year, right? So it's still going up, but it's going up at a slower rate is what's been done. So we are never getting back to the old days of egg prices and gas price. Well, gas is a little bit different because there's a bunch of wild cards in there, but grocery prices and other general prices. So countries who don't have sound money policies, where there's many countries out there that when they run out of money, instead of raising taxes, they think it's a good idea to just print off more money. Hey, let's go buy some stuff. Literally, that's what they do, right? And so that ends up being inflationary. That's not too dissimilar than what the United States did during this COVID period there's some technicalities that they're not actually printing off money, but they effectively did a similar thing. And so countries that keep our money sound allow us as consumers and investors and family members to make good decisions with our money, with our budgeting, right? When we don't know what the price of eggs is going to be, we can't make as good of decisions. So countries that have sound money policies end up encouraging more economic freedom because you're free to buy different things, make long-term investments, and other aspects of your life. All right, protect property rights and enforce contracts evenly. So if we call up 911 right now in the United States, how long is it going to take an officer to get here? What do you think? What would you say if we dialed up 911 right now? 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes at most? When I give this talk in Guatemala, they laugh. They laugh. The police aren't coming, right? They're just not coming. So if you don't have police and other forces there to protect your property, whether it's your person or your property if they stole, that's taking away your economic freedom, right? You have to spend money on security forces. In developing countries around the world, when I visit, when they're building a new house, you know what the first thing they build? When they buy a brand new piece of property to build a house? They build a fence. And it's a concrete fence, and it usually has glass shards at the top of it or barbed wire or something else. I see some of my international students shaking their heads because that's the way things are done. You have to spend money yourself to protect your own stuff. It's not there through other means. And so having a police system that's sound, and then courts. Other countries, bribing judges, all that's real. That can happen. So, we talk a lot in the United States about some unfair court cases and some things that might go on and, makes the headlines. But in general, we're really good. We really good have a good rule of law, a good court system. In general, if you take somebody to court, you can feel like you're going to get a fair judgment, right? My son just had their landlord try to charge them for carpet of the apartment that they moved out of that was 3 years old, and I thought it was ordinary wear and tear. And I said, take them to court. It's a small claims, it's easy, but I'm in the real estate business, so I've taken people to court lots of times, but take them to court, right? You should feel comfortable, if you feel like your property rights were violated, then that's the system we have in place to get it corrected, to get some justice. All right, but in many countries around the world, they don't have that. Next area, refrain from imposing trade barriers. The United States was a leader around the world on this one for pretty much forever, at least since the 1930s, 40s. And now Trump is doing what? What's his big thing? Tariffs, right? So tariffs restrict our economic freedom in the sense that a policy is changing my ability to buy from my brothers and sisters around the world, right, at a lower price. The tariff is an artificial cost to me as an American that now is discouraging my economic freedom. So having low trade barriers, there's other types of trade barriers of quotas and regulations and other things that are there. So that area kind of captures that, but tariffs are right near the top. And then finally, regulations that undermine voluntary exchange. So occupational licensing. You have to spend about $20,000 to cut hair in the United States, to get a license to cut hair. So if some of my college students are either braiding hair or giving haircuts, for $5 on the side or whatever, they belong in jail, right? It's like cutting hair is illegal without a license. How many of you know some people who've cut hair or braided hair on the side? It's technically illegal. They are supposed to have a license for that. If some of the hairstylists in town, they hear that that's going on, it's happened in other towns in different ways. Lemonade stands, we've had 9-year-olds have lemonade stands, have problems. Here in Ottawa, I have my friend here tonight, he sells honey. There was another person that was wanting to make honey, and they had bees on their property, and they were selling it at the market, and they had tried to shut them down. And the Kansas Policy Institute kind of intervened with Sam McRoberts, and Justice, help me out here. Justice Institute. Yeah, that's right. Okay. KGAI, and represented them. And kudos to Ottawa and their leaders. Mike, were you a part of that when that happened?
When was that?
Oh, what do you think, James? 5 years ago or something?
Yeah, 22 or 23.
Yeah, because it was during COVID. Anyway, Ottawa cooperated and we changed the law. But the law on the books was that you couldn't have a home business with bees on your property or live animals unless it was inside your home. That was the catch. It was in her backyard because they're bees. Don't feel like having bees inside the house. And so that's an example of occupational licensing that is infringing. When I went to India to get a haircut, there's a guy that comes down from his apartment upstairs. He sets up a table, puts up a mirror, puts a little shelter up above, and he starts cutting hair. Right? And the haircut is like 50 cents essentially in American money. Well, he didn't have no license or anything, right? But that's how he's eating tonight, right? That's how he's making a living. So in other countries around the world, it can be either easier or harder to do that. And occupational licensing is one of the things in the United States that kind of keeps us back in terms of labor market freedom. All right, so those are kind of a snapshot of things that I wanted to fill in as we get into more details. All right, so This next slide I hadn't actually used. This is kind of special for this presentation, but I found it on the Fraser Institute. And it highlights kind of a distinction between economic freedom and personal freedom. So you get to do what you want with your own body, freedom to worship, marriage restrictions, so the things that might be more in your personal life. And then economic freedom is the stuff we've been talking about more with transactions and exchanging with people, that you have those sorts of freedom. And so then they got this overlap here that thinks about working out of your home like we did with the bees. And then you have the right to your own labor. So this goes back, we had our first speaker, Rachel Ferguson, talk about that one of the fundamental rights is that you have the right to your labor. Like you should get if you go work for somebody, you get the earnings to it, right? So kind of some of those fundamental rights that were covered in some earlier lectures. Okay, so the official 5 areas that we're measuring in this Economic Freedom Index, we're ultimately trying to come up with a number that reflects how much economic freedom is in a country. And so those areas that I went through are summarized here with these 5 areas. And then we also do the state. So when I say we, I don't actually participate in the calculation of it, but Jim Gortney was the lead author in the Economic Freedom Index. And so we all use American currency, so like sound money's not there, right? So we have 3 different categories that we're looking at: Kansas versus California versus Minnesota, right? Like how are these varying from state to state? Something that the Kansas Policy Institute participates in regularly. So that is what we'll be talking about tonight. There's 165 countries now that they have data on. So places like North Korea, Kim Jong-un doesn't like to share his data very much. And so there's some outliers there that are shaded in gray, but there's 42 variables, all external. So one thing I like about this index is that we're gathering data from other surveys. It's not some smart guys in a room saying, I think Colombia is pretty good, right? And they're giving a ranking or something, and then they're synergizing that. So they're taking data, survey data in many cases, and then data on gross domestic product, the national income, all of that stuff, ultimately getting a 0 to 10 ranking in those 5 areas. And then the final number is a simple average of those 5 numbers. So that's the number that you'll see as we work through some things here. All right, so this is the latest report. And so this color coding is important. It doesn't show up on the screen very well, but we've got these blue or turquoise countries. They are in the first quartile. So of those 165 countries, the top 25% are the blue countries. And then the red countries are the least free, the bottom 25%. And then we have this kind of yellow and green. This is kind of a neon green and a yellow. And so you can kind of see what the world looks like. South America's been making some improvements. That used to be mostly red, but there's been some changes there. Africa, still mostly red. And we've got Russia up there. Putin likes to be red. So that is kind of a glimpse of it. And real quickly here, I'm going to pull up the actual map. So here's the website, freetheworld.com. And if you run your cursor over it, it tells you the ranking. So the top 10 countries are here. Hong Kong's been on top, but they've been kind of battling China lately. 8.5, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, and then the United States. This comes in 5 at 8.1. And then you've got all 165 countries there. And you can scroll around and see what they are. And so you can also highlight some. So United States, how about Iran? I was thinking that might be kind of a fun one to do. Ooh, red, imagine that. China. Russia. And so they kind of spring up on the map this way, but then you can also go to a graph that shows what they've looked like over time. And you can see some of them back here in this time frame this was like the 1980s, and then they can improve. This has been the United States, been relatively at the top. And then from a research standpoint, it's nice to be able to see those 5 areas: size of government, legal property, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, regulation, And United States is 5, but we might not be the top dog in every category. So we can kind of see how countries vary around the world. Like China is actually very good on sound money, even though we know they're basically hedging communist, socialist type of system, right? But they keep their money very sound. So they have good marks on that, but then fall short on some other areas. And so this is the comparison that we'll do. And then we've got one for the United States as well. All right, let me pause there for any questions so far? Okay. So let's get back onto this thing. All right, so blah, 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 economic freedom, 5 areas, I get it. Why is this important, right? This is why I get excited about this stuff. And I'm sorry that's probably kind of hard to see some of this, but maybe at the risk of, is it going to ruin your thing if I hit the lights? Just for this part maybe, and that doesn't even help too much. We're going to need a new projector, I think. So this is income per person in each country. And so what we see is repeated is that we've got the blue, the freest over here is 66,000, and the least free 10,000. This, now you might say, well, things are cheaper over in Bangladesh or whatever. Well, this has all been done an economic equalization called purchasing power parity. So we've taken into account inflation and currency changes, and everything has been kind of relabeled back into the dollar. So we're basically being as fair as possible with the comparison. And so this is real numbers. So if I like to think of it as in hamburgers, if we ever got back to $1 hamburger, this might be, I need to come up with something different, but in these free countries, you can buy the average person can buy 66,000 hamburgers. This person can buy 10,000 hamburgers, right? So we've kind of equalized the purchasing power of the income. So this is a real number, a real difference. As countries become more free, we go from 10 to 12 to 34 to 66. So we see this progression that and economic freedom turns out to be complicated. That's why we got these 5 areas. We got 42 different variables. We're pulling in a lot of different things, and we get this result that income is higher on average. So my Uncle Sam once said, well, you know, Russ, money's not the most important thing in life, right? And then he says, but it's right up there in the top 5, isn't it? And so you start thinking of the things you can do with your money, whether that's helping people out, giving to charity, funding a college, you know, you name it. This is a real big difference, especially even just from the second quartile to the top quartile. All right. Life expectancy. Bet you didn't think I was going to hit you with that one. Freest countries, 79 years. Least free countries, 62 years. Now, is 17 years of life important? Is that a decent amount of time? It's a decent amount of time, right? 17 years. Some of the college students that are in here, that's well over half of your life, right? So if you live in a country that is set up to be more free with freer policies, people live longer. And once again, 62 years in the least free, 66, 75, 79. So we see that progression. What does more income allow you to do? Better health care, for one thing, right? So that kind of falls in line that there's things you can do, preventative medicine. My wife Dana's here. She does trips to Guatemala bringing supplements and other care and other medical equipment. She has medical missions that we do down there. They don't have that stuff. They don't have access to that stuff. They have free health care, though, but it's not so free when you can't get it and you don't have access to it. And possibly you don't have the income to supplement it. All right, infant mortality. How many people like live babies as opposed to dead babies? Show of hand, live babies. Okay, I want to see a lot of hands go up. Well, that's what infant mortality is. So over here, we've got the mortality rate per 1,000 live births. So there's a live birth, and in these less free countries, 52 babies die. In the most free countries, 5. Very significant on healthcare outcome there with infant mortality. And again, as countries get more and more free, 52, 35, 13, and then 5. So we see that same progression that makes a difference. Now you might also notice, if you've been following these dots, maybe I should have said this a little bit earlier, they have the countries out there. So it's possible that there's a country like Argentina that actually has low infant mortality, right? But they're in a less free country. So it's possible, but there's a lot of variance. That's why we see all these scatter plots here, so that the average ends up being pretty high because it's fairly noisy. So it's not that it's not possible, it's just not likely that you're going to have as good outcomes as countries that are here. Now look at how tight this distribution is here, where the countries, if you're in one of these free countries, you're kind of in that zone somewhere in under 20 with the infant mortality rate. All right. So how about the poor people? What about the poor? It must be capitalism creates poor people and rich people and the division between the rich and the poor. Well, here's what the data shows. It's actually pretty even, Steven. The percent of people, whether you're in a not free country or a most free country, the average percent, the number of people in poverty, this is the bottom 10% of the income earners, bottom 10%, it's pretty even, Steven. But here's where capitalism works. If you have 2%, I'd rather have 2% of 66,000 rather than 2% of 10,000. So you are much better off in a free country, even if you're in the bottom 10% of the earning scale, right? And so here it shows the average in those free countries is 9,700. We're at 1,200. So this gets into I'm hungry. I can't feed myself, right? This is $1,200 a year, and it's been adjusted for purchasing power. How many people spent $5 at least at Starbucks this morning, right? Think about that. When the purchasing power here, that is what we're talking about. You don't have that same ability in those other countries, and you're just trying to put basic rice and beans on the shelf. All right. I wanted to point out this just a little bit. So we have Qatar and United Arab Emirates. So they're not so free, not as many women rights and other things going on in the Arab countries, but what do they got? Oil. So it's possible that we can have some of these outcomes in those countries higher because of other reasons, but they are the exception, not the rule. Most of the countries are right in here, right? But it's possible that some of the countries, and usually, actually the Middle East has been pretty good in terms of overall prosperity, but Venezuela is the poster child of what not to do with your country, one of the most oil-rich countries in the world, and their place is a disaster now. Most of them have gone over to my graduate assistant's country, Colombia, and my other student, Colombia. So a lot of migration from Venezuela to Colombia because it was a disaster with the policies that they pursued. So Venezuela falls in rock bottom on the economic freedom list. Okay, so here we've got economic freedom and poverty, just poverty in general. So 25% difference. 52% of the country living in poverty, 2% living in poverty. So that follows with the income there. And so lots of interesting studies on how our poor live relative to other places that with poverty. Our people in poverty have a refrigerator, a cell phone, a car, right? So people in poverty can still have some of those material things that you don't have in other countries. And so the living in poverty is much easier. There's always a struggle, but relative to other countries, it's a lot easier. Average hours per week. This one kind of surprised me. They didn't have this one on the list in the past. So not only are we making more money, but we're working less. So 33 hours is the average hours worked, 33 for the freer countries versus 40 hours, 37, 38 for the other countries. So we can afford leisure. We can afford not to work. Personal freedom. So minorities, LGBTQ, if you want to be treated in a more fair way and have more personal freedom, free countries do that for you. So this is an index of personal freedom. They've done lots of studies where they've done women's rights and other things, and so they this year developed this personal freedom. They're using another index, and so again, you have more of those personal freedoms. That's why I wanted to put that first slide up there, the things that we're talking about, ability to worship, your own religion, all that stuff, more personal freedoms in freer countries. So we see that positive correlation between economic freedom and personal freedom. Non-corruption, again, if you have sound police and sound court system, you tend not to have as much corruption. So we do work, as I said, we got a student trip to Guatemala this year again, and they have problems with corruption. A lot of third world countries have corruption problems, and so that'll usually be police being, bribed, or courts or other things, mafia-run places. We've had some horrific stories of that down in Guatemala, and so we don't tend to have that as often in freer countries. So, notable exception, Italy. Oh, Italy, the Italian, all the movies, right? So that shows up there in the data. Okay, so apparently there's still a little, relative to the United States, a little more corruption in Italy. Okay, the environment. If you like the environment, you might be like, some people are, anti-capitalist, we got to have government step in and fix the problem. It turns out in countries that are more capitalist, which, by the way, includes Switzerland, the Netherlands, Denmark, some of those democratic socialists in the United States that point to those countries and say, we're like them. No, we're not, actually. We're in the same game. They're very much capitalists over there. They sometimes have bigger social safety nets in different ways, but they would never call themselves a socialist country. They are a market-driven place. If you're in this turquoise zone as measured by this index, I promise you are more capitalist than socialist, for sure. And so to point at those countries and say that is just the data says otherwise. It's not the case. All right, so the environment, I guess I got sidetracked on that. Environmental issues, again, I think a lot of this comes down to income. We care about the environment. You have the money to care for the environment. You can have policies in place at a personal level, possibly at a government level as well. And so that's what we see, the environmental performance of free countries that are more market-based, more individual economic freedom. Those countries take care of the environment much better than the other countries. Life satisfaction. So economists like to measure happiness. So this particular study is on a scale of 0 to 10. What do you think about your life satisfaction? And so they collect this data from people. Again, it's not the perfect data, but look at what it comes in, 4.5, 4.9, 5.9, 6.6. So in places where there's more economic freedom, more personal freedom, people have self-reported happiness levels that are higher than other places. All right, well, let's move into the state analysis here for a moment. So Kansas is ranked 14th. We fell out of the top quartile, and so that's why it's got that green shade to it. Our socialist friends in California, red, as you can imagine. Mamdani in New York, red, right? So more restrictions on your personal freedoms with the policies that are in place. That's what's being measured here. And so the blue Texas and Florida have been free for a long time. The Dakotas. So that's kind of a smattering. Our next door neighbors, Colorado, they actually have more free policies at the state level as well. All right, so let's dig into this a little bit more. We get some of the same results that in states, and by the way, this is North America, so this includes the Canadian provinces and Mexico, but in states where there's more economic freedom, there's also higher levels of income in those states at the state level. Okay, so similar analysis, 50 states, 0 to 10. We got the 3 categories now that we're using to end up getting a single number. And so here's your top 10 this year. So this is this year, the most recent, by the way, with data being lagging is 23. And this was 2016. So I put this in here so you can see how Policies change from time to time, and sometimes you're slipping in terms of economic freedom, and sometimes you're gaining. So Kansas fell out. We got Kansas here as 14, and otherwise that's your top 10 there. That was the top 10 then. The least free countries, New York in 2016 made some movement up, because I'm not sure what New Mexico did, but I don't follow that. But somehow New Mexico was here at 42, and then they continued to restrict people in some way, shape, or form in terms of economic freedom. I highlighted West Virginia just to show they were 49, but they made some policy changes in their state, and they're 42, so they're climbing the rank. The point is that state policy is very complex. There's a lot of moving parts. This is one thing that gives us a outside external metric to measure what's happening with freedom and whether we're moving the direction of freedom or whether we're not. So here's Kansas specifically. So Kansas is 11 in the government spending area. So there's 3 subcategories that are being tallied together for Area 1. And so that first one is government spending. So they subtract out some other stuff, transfers, welfare programs, other things. So it's really just what is the state spending. And we are currently 5.9 and we were 7.8. So there's been some changes from 2016 to now that have caused us to fall in that particular area. So I put that one in red. In green, we were actually up slightly here with transfers and subsidies as a part. So as we start to move money from one person to the next, we're going to subsidize solar, we're going to subsidize this, we're going to tax corporations, we're going to increase welfare spending, we're going to increase spending to the arts. As we're moving money around, we end up losing some money too. So if they tax $5, we're probably lucky if 80 cents gets to the other place. So through government having to pay for their operations and other things, that ends up not being a dollar for dollar thing to do. And again, is part of what's calculated in terms of your personal individual freedom as you live here in Kansas. So retirement, insurance payments, so employment insurance, workers' compensation, all of that stuff, again, slightly up in that category. Taxes. So 5.1 and we were 7.0. So we've seen some personal and income payroll taxes change over that time that caused us to drop slightly overall. We maintained here at 7. Property taxes and other percentage. I know that we're always talking about property taxes being high in Kansas, so they probably stayed relatively the same is what I'm guessing, and it's these other taxes that caused us to improve in that area, because it was a pretty substantial improvement, 5.9 to 8.3. Sales tax as a percentage, so again, a gain there. So we haven't been bumping up that. I don't know if there was different changes or some fell off or what. Labor market, minimum wage. So Kansas is 10 and was 7.2. So this is a spot where Missouri is starting to fall. Arizona, people are coming up with minimum wage. I don't want to get sidetracked on a minimum wage argument, but when states raise minimum wage, it creates unemployment. And so what if you are living in a state where it's $15 and you're like, I would love to work for $12. You just had some of your personal economic freedom infringed upon because you can't find a job, right? You'd be willing to work for 12, but you can't find a job. That's kind of a little snippet of what's being measured here in terms of your individual economic freedom. You're not able to sell your labor at the price you want to sell it at. All right, and then union density, that was pretty much a push, down slightly. We always have this border rivalry, so I thought this would be fun. So Missouri is 22 and Kansas is 14. Overall, government spending, Kansas is above in that category. Taxes, Missouri is higher, which means Missouri's taxes are lower. But have you guys driven on the roads over in Missouri? Sometimes I kind of wonder what's going on. So anyway, there's balancing act. This isn't like a perfect thing, but at least allows you some outside comparisons with the data. And then labor market freedom, we're higher, and I think that's because of some of the minimum wage stuff that Missouri started putting in place. All right, so I'll kind of conclude here with how the index could be used to look at maybe some trouble spots in Kansas where they're falling. So I took these two red ones. So we've seen government spending increase. So the recommendation from Russ McCullough, that probably won't be listened to, is let's not do it more than where we're at. Let's not increase it. Maybe there's some good reasons not to decrease it, but that would tend to take away economic freedom. And since I'm a believer in that, that's kind of the direction I head, right? And so here, the income and payroll tax, again, was 5.1 before, and we were at 7.0. So again, don't look towards income and payroll taxes as a way to maybe balance the budget or other things, because we might have some of those negative consequences that come along with decreasing economic freedom. All right, so we'll move on to some discussion, and I don't know, James, if you wanted to lead us off or come up and talk for a little bit so I can take a break.
No, that's fine. I'll let you
Oh yeah, let's
catch your breath and then introduce myself. My name is James Franco. I'm the president of Kansas Policy Institute, and the Pearson-Eby Liberty Academy is a joint venture between the Gortney Institute and KPI. As Russ said, trying to educate folks in some of the principles that undergird what I interact with in my day job when it comes to questions of public policy and what should the state or what shouldn't the state be doing. If you strip away all the mission statements and all this other kind of stuff about what my job at Kansas Policy Institute is, technically it's a think tank, that's what I tell certain people, but if you strip all that away, I'm a lobbyist, right? So when I go to Topeka, I wear the little mark of the beast that I have to wear in my name tag when I step onto any state property to let all the legislators know that I'm there one way or another selling something, right? What I like to think I'm selling is the idea of freedom and liberty. And we're going to start calling on people or encouraging you all to ask questions here in just a couple minutes. So be ready to ask something. Otherwise, you're not getting out of here earlier if you don't ask something. So you might as well just bite the bullet and be ready to ask something. But a couple of thoughts based on what Russ said and some of the work that KPI and KJI does. I'm going to correct you only slightly, though, in one sense. That when it came to hair braiding, right? Up until just a few years ago, you had to have a government permission slip to be a hair braider, to braid somebody's hair. And it took a special exemption that the legislature passed to exempt hair braiding from the need for a cosmetology license. A couple of years after that, we filed suit on behalf of an immigrant family from India, actually, who was engaged in eyebrow threading. And this is the idea of using a piece of cotton thread to kind of shape and remove unwanted hair from, hence the name, your eyebrows, right? And we didn't think that family who was trying to hire their mother, right, who didn't speak English, the cosmetology exam was in English, right? She couldn't take it. She had to spend upwards of $20,000 to get her cosmetology license. She had to spend 1,500 hours of training, right, in order to get this license so that she could remove hair from somebody's eyebrow with a piece of cotton thread. This is not an inherently dangerous thing. This is not knee surgery or brain surgery or something like this, right? This is not practicing law. Whether they need, a permission slip from the government is a different question. A couple of years ago, we have another lawsuit where we filed on behalf of another mom who wants to use the technique of sugaring to remove hair. Again, so this is water, sugar, and lemon juice that you kind of turn into a paste and use it to remove hair. And again, $20,000, 1,500 hours to be able to sugar. That bill passed the legislature. The legislature passed that bill to say, okay, that person does not need a cosmetology license, but the governor vetoed it. And in many of these cases, right, there may be, I'm not conceding anything, but maybe there is on some level, a basis for saying, hey, this is for public health or one way or another. But oftentimes what we see is where one of these things bubbles up is with the best of intentions. The way it functions in practice is that it's actually keeping new entrants from entering this market. It's protecting the people who already have that cosmetology license or whatever it may be, and it's making it harder for other people to kind of enter the workforce and provide for their families. And then it was a lady named Ellen Finnerty here in Ottawa who wanted to have bees. And this is the kicker. This is just what makes this almost laughably funny as far as I'm concerned. is she was allowed to have bees on her property as long as she didn't sell the honey.
Mm.
But when she sold the honey at the farmer's market, it became a home-based business that did not take place within her actual home, and therefore it became illegal. So we sued on her behalf and said, hey, she's not doing anything that she wouldn't be able to do if she was just, she wanted honey on her scones in the morning, right? But because she was trying to sell it, now it became inherently dangerous. And as Russ said, the city of Ottawa, after they were faced with this suit, changed their ordinance, and now Ellen's able to sell some honey.
And I'm glad we lost.
Right. Well, you didn't lose, right? In this case, it was discretion being the better part of valor, right? In that they saw the error of their ways and corrected course, which is all any of us can hope for, right? And then the last thing that I want to say here, and then again, I'm contemplating a couple of questions if you all don't ask, but it's better for all of us if you guys are asking questions, not just me, is to me there's a big distinction when we're talking about economic freedom, about the idea between being pro-market and pro-business, right? Because in lots of these countries or in these different states, or even in Kansas, an example I'll talk about in a second, excuse me, is it's very easy for politicians from any party, right? This is not a Republican or Democrat or a Libertarian or Democratic Socialist thing or anything else, right? It's that they are pro-business and they like to talk about it that way, but what they're really doing is giving a subsidy to some particular business. Right, in Kansas, we've seen this just in the last couple of years. We gave gobs and 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 gobs of money to Panasonic to build a battery plant up in DeSoto, Kansas. Right, and the question you have to ask yourself with anything that government does, because as Russ alluded to, right, there is some basic level of taxation that's necessary, is are we willing to take money from this dude? What's your name?
Felix.
Felix? Are we willing to take money from Felix in the form of taxes and give it to this woman? What's your name?
Janet.
Janet?
Yes.
All right. So is that okay to take money from him and give it to her? Right? Which is essentially what we've done, is we've taxed everybody in this room, we've taxed everybody in this state in the form of income taxes. We've said, okay, we're going to now give a lot of that money to Panasonic. Or we're going to give it to a company in Wichita called Integra. Or by implication, we're going to give it to the Chiefs to move
I was
out.
going to say a football
to,
team.
to move a football team about 20 miles from Kansas City, Missouri to Kansas City, Kansas, so that we can all cheer for Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce or whatever, right? And if you wanted to make that argument that that's good for Kansas to have, you could. But you shouldn't be making it on the sense that this is good for our economic development. If this is part of just what makes Kansas a fun, neat place to live, is to have the Chiefs 20 miles closer to Topeka than they otherwise were, then you can do that. But we shouldn't say that it's because it's going to create all of this economic benefit. So when we're talking about economic freedom for me, right, and what influences a lot of the work that KPI does in Topeka or in city halls and county courthouses around the state, is that difference between what it means to be pro-business. Because lots of politicians can very plausibly say, hey, I'm pro-business. But what they mean is, I like Acme Industries, right? Not Smith Industries over here. And a lot of the stuff that we were talking about early on with those rankings is there the even application of the law? Are taxes even and predictable across time and across businesses and stuff like that? So we're not picking this one company that we're going to lower their tax liability, which means that by implication we're going to raise everybody else's tax liability at the same time. So our goal at the Pearson-Eby Liberty Academy, and working with Russ and his folks at Gortney, is to talk about the big theoretical academic questions of economic liberty, or all the different things that we've done up until this point. Right before, at the end of the spring, we had my colleague at the Kansas Justice Institute talking about constitutional rights. We've had folks talking about a variety of different things that undergird these ideas of personal liberty and stuff like that. Not just so that if you're running for office, which most of us will never do, right? Many of us might, but then at least when somebody comes and says, hey, what do you think about this idea? There's a little bit more of a grounding there, as opposed to just whatever the soundbite is, or whatever the next TikTok video is, or God forbid, whatever you see in a campaign video or a campaign commercial over the course of the next 3 months as we really get into the teeth of an upcoming electoral campaign. So, happy to answer any questions that you all have. Any takers early on? Not everybody want? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
And I'm a complete stranger here. I'm not a business major or anything. And
Okay.
as far as I know, I don't know anything about the economy. But after listening to the great lecture, I do have a question. And it actually touches on something you both said. Dr. McCullough mentioned that he mentioned a few Northern European countries as being examples of free market, but also having good social safety nets. And a big part of that is high taxes. And then you mentioned that an argument against high taxes is the example of a city like Ottawa going and building a Sonic, like the third Sonic or whatever. My question then is, should the argument then be for lower taxes, or should then the argument be, let's focus our resources, instead of trying to lower the taxes, to making sure that the people who do yield the responsibility of spending the taxes make the right decisions with the money that we can get from taxes?
Yeah, the right decisions is the hardest part. So if we go back to those categories, it's not fair to just look at taxes only, and that's why those countries in some cases are more free than the United States or other places, because even though they have a higher tax system, size of government, so they might fall short on that category, they don't have any regulations. You can braid hair, you can cut hair, you can open business. It's real easy to open businesses. In Estonia, it takes like 17 minutes. Everything's been on the internet, whereas in the United States, it might take you hours. Some people might have to hire an attorney to set up a legal entity, right? So what kind of barriers are there to starting up business? And so this statement that James brought up, I wrote on the board while you were talking, Adam Smith brought up in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, that we should expect businesses to collude and conspire to take advantage of the consumer. You should totally expect that. And so you need a strong rule of law through police and courts and the law of the land that encourages competition, keeps barriers to entry low. So those countries are doing that better in many cases than the United States. And so that's the balancing act that the data shows, so that they can still argue that they are a market-based economy, even though they do choose to have that system of larger social safety net.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is I think they've made, maybe not a deliberate calculation, but at this point a solid calculation to where they've said, okay, our country values having a strong social safety net, right? The way we pay for that is, yes, by higher taxes, but it means we also have to have enough economic growth that we can finance that. So they, to Russ's point, they've made a conscious choice of trade-offs to where they've said, okay, we're going to have higher taxes to pay for more, healthcare or what have you. But as a result of that, we're going to lower all these other things so that businesses can be churning and creating a lot of opportunity and a lot of revenue for the government, right? So that they can finance the operation rather than having both high regulations and high taxes and a high safety net. This one.
Isn't it also true in most of those northern European countries, population is low, it's also a very homogeneous population, so culturally it's very acceptable to be a certain way, and so that doesn't have as much of an influence as, say, they don't have a lot of it's starting to, it'll be interesting to see the data as it comes now that there's more immigrant migration into some of those countries, but they don't have the melting pot that, like, say, the United States has, or some of those other countries, which also leads to their legal system being a certain way and the protection of property rights not needing to be a certain way. Like, it's just part of the culture to be a way. Would that have an effect on that as well?
Yeah, as you're drinking, I think so. They're culturally homogenous, so there's a certain expectation of how one treats their neighbors or some of these kinds of things, as opposed to in very different types of communities where there's different cultures, none of which are inherently better or worse necessarily, but you have different cultures coming together into different types of communities, into different cities and things like that, whereas life is different here in Ottawa than it is in Kansas City, Kansas, than it is in New York State, right, than it is in the United States or Oslo or something like that, right? It's just very different because they're more culturally homogenous communities.
I want to touch back on your comment too on, should we argue to lower taxes or whatever. That's what's wrong with our political system, right? Is that what I just gave you in 45 minutes is a pretty tough political slogan, right? And so what do we run on? Low taxes, no taxes, right? Tax the rich, blah, blah, whatever. We got all these things that we focus in on one thing, and really there's a whole number of things that need to be discussed. You'd like to think through good discussion and deliberation and, advertisements that the truth percolates up, like all this little stuff, eventually gets there. But then we have this thing in economics called rational ignorance. And that is that most people purposely choose not to engage in politics because they got better things to do with their life, right? The payoff to them isn't worth it. Because does their vote count? No. I'm not aware, even at the local level, was anything decided by one vote this year? At the midterm?
Not
at the
not at the primary last week. There are a couple of Kansas House races that are handfuls of votes.
Okay, handfuls, but still not one, not your vote. So unlike what MTV tells you, your vote doesn't count. It really doesn't matter. Now, should you help persuade people? Your vote starts to count if you're kind of into it and you get other people to go to the polls, right? Then we might have, and that's how we have small factions can lead to overturning policy, because most of the average Joes out there are choosing to stay disengaged. So rational ignorance is very much real and very much a problem that is almost impossible to overcome, I think, in the United States, until stuff gets real bad. Then all of a sudden people are like, boy, 20 years ago this wouldn't have happened. I'm getting out to the vote. I'd have to say there's a little bit of that with Trump getting back. Trump 1.0 and 2.0. There was a little bit of that. Like, people started to have the sense of, I don't like the direction, and so that is something that's difficult to overcome in the political marketplace, for sure. Yeah.
I found the data that you were showing interesting regarding like the international level versus the state level of economic freedom, because you would think, well, I personally would have thought that California or New York or those more like progressive states would have more economic freedom than like Florida or Kansas. And I was just kind of curious on is it because they have higher taxes, or what your take is it because there's more population there compared to like Kansas, or I was just kind of curious on
it's a little bit all of the above. So high minimum wages would be falling into this category. Certainly taxation in New York and Florida. There's some other interesting studies on municipalities that measure migration patterns. So people are leaving California, going to Phoenix and Texas. People are leaving New York and going to Florida. And so as those policies change and they're like, I can't afford 60% taxes, basically, more or less in some cases when you add them all up. So yeah, that drives probably most of the California, New York type of story. But there's other restrictions. California, you guys ever notice on things you buy, it says, but if you're in California, be warned about this, this, and this. And they kind of pride themselves on that, but those are all additional restrictions beyond the federal that California imposes that restricts trade, because sometimes that means maybe it can't cross the border, or Californians can't buy it, or whatever. So
a couple of thoughts. One, the states that are creating the most jobs and the states where people are moving to are states that are more economically free. So you have states like Texas and Florida, those states with no state income tax, that are growing significantly compared to states like California, New York, Illinois, things like this. Every 10 years, it sounds like we have some international students, right? We do a census in the United States, and for the first time after that 2020 census, for the first time since California was admitted to the Union, they did not add a congressional seat, which on one hand doesn't really matter, but what it means is relative to the rest of the country, California is no longer growing. Right, because you get more congressional seats in the United States House of Representatives based on how many people live in a state relative to the rest of the country. And it means that people are leaving California, and it is growing slower than it otherwise has in the past, where it has continually been on this leading edge of a lot of America's economic dynamism, right? And so on some level you can point to something like Silicon Valley and say, oh my gosh, look at this, it exists in California, why wouldn't we emulate them? But Friedrich Bastiat, another kind of dashboard saint of free market economics, would say that there's the seen and the unseen. So what would Silicon Valley be like if California weren't such a basket case? And when they started talking about taxing wealth just a couple of months ago, right, a lot of the people who are creating those companies, whether you like Google or Facebook or Anthropic or what have you, we're talking about, okay, well then we're just going to move, right? And to my mind, again, a very important thing to keep in mind when talking about the idea of economic freedom is that the wealthy are going to do just fine. They have the wherewithal, they have the social capital, if not the real capital, to move, right? So they're going to legally avoid their taxes, right? Or minimize their tax liability. Whereas the rest of us here as W-2 earners, we're kind of stuck, right? So the policies that we're implementing for somebody else higher up the income chain, which typically means politically like the guy who makes just a little bit more than me, right, is other people have more of a capacity to absorb those things, to move them, to adjust how they live their life, to avoid those taxes, to avoid their policies. Whereas, without casting with too broad of a brush here, I'm guessing most of the people in this room show up to work every day, collect a paycheck, pay their taxes and stuff like that. We don't have the same wherewithal to avoid bad policies that other folks do.
Yeah. So unfortunately, a lot of these policies are what we call a negative income tax. They disproportionately hurt the poor more than they hurt the rich, because the rich have the ability to move money or buy different assets or rearrange things and loopholes and all of that. And the poor are stuck there either without a job, or it's difficult to start my own business. When we talk about this occupational licensing, that's people who aren't totally loaded, right? If you're trying to sell honey out of your home, and so it's usually disproportionately hurting the poor more than the rich. Lexus.
Okay, so I had a question backing on what you were talking about, like the chiefs in the state and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. So how you were talking about like not placing economic value within calling it that within like them moving over and whatnot. So how can we not classify that to be like economically valuable or not? So I'm from Ottawa, like it's my hometown, I grew up here. So obviously, like if you travel to the city right now before even the Chiefs get there, it's going to be more expensive for certain items and prices and things up there, as opposed to just buying something maybe local from someone in Ottawa. So if it's not an economic change or anything, how can we, like I'm just curious, like how do we like not classify that with like the Chiefs coming up there? Things will be more expensive up there. Like how does that kind of go through?
Well, two things then you can answer as well. One, maybe I wasn't being clear enough. What I was saying is like, if a politician who was in favor of, because the state legislature had to pass a change in the law to incentivize the chiefs to come across with this thing called star bonds, right? We'll table that for a second, okay? But it took an affirmative act of the legislature and the governor to sign that bill to change the law to allow them to come, okay? What I was trying to make the point of saying is that, like, look, if you want to do that because you think it's just really neat to have the chiefs in Western Wyandotte County, then you can make that argument. You can say, look, this is the kind of state we want to have. We want to be this destination. We want to be, we want to have a sports team. We want Patrick Mahomes to be celebrating here, not there, right? You can make that argument, but it's not really, or I don't think it should be made as an economic development argument. It's a quality of life or a cultural thing, right? But then to that specific point, the first Star Bond project that we had in the state was for the racetrack that's also in Western Wyandotte County, right? And some of the ancillary development around it. So two things. One, we had a professor at the University of Kansas named Art Hall do a study on this. And the racetrack aside, part of that big development out at the Legends, I don't know if you guys have all ever driven past it at 435 and I-70, right, is the Nebraska Furniture Mart, right? Massive retail store for, as the name suggests, furniture, not necessarily from Nebraska. And he looked at furniture sales within, a certain, I don't know if this is exactly correct, but let's say within a 50-mile radius of that location. And what you saw was when Nebraska Furniture Mart came in and it was subsidized to come into that location, you saw furniture sales at all of these other furniture stores around the area decrease. So it didn't actually increase any economic activity. It simply shifted it from Russ's Sofa Emporium, right, to,
It's got a nice ring.
yeah, it's a business opportunity, right? Just ask for a subsidy, you'll be fine. To Nebraska Furniture Mart. So it didn't actually increase overall economic activity, it simply shifted it. So on the idea of the Chiefs Stadium, if there's any Chiefs fans, it won't fundamentally change your life if you're driving up to 435 and going right or left to go to the football game in 10 years, right? It's not going to fundamentally change the demand. There's still going to be a stadium. It's just going to shift it around a little bit. And is that a good use of our tax dollars?
Yeah. There's no sports economics study that's ever supported stadiums. I'll just keep it real short. And it's amazing because all these economic arguments, the governor gets on, everybody's making these claims. Just go look at real research, and there's not been one that supports that. So, and it's actually the substitution effect is the thing that always gets overlooked. So all of a sudden, instead of going to the bar in the Legends area, we're going to the Chiefs Stadium. So I'm spending dollars there instead of spending dollars here, and that cannibalization of the money is where it gets kind of sucked out and doesn't have the impact. So they just focus on 60,000 seats, X amount per seat. There's going to be this much revenue coming in, but they don't talk about, oh, they would have spent it at the bar over here, but they're not spending it there anymore. So it's that substitution effect that's the big one on that. Yep.
I have two questions, and one for each of you. Let's start with the data that you showed us was till 2023. I believe that's what
Yep.
most of that data.
Yeah, that was the most recent one.
And including the Kansas data. Now, starting in 2023, Kansas policy changed and reduced taxation by about $1 billion a year. Not quite half of that, 400 and some million, was by removing the 6.5% sales tax on groceries.
Right.
Which
That was a big deal.
would be a benefit to all people who buy groceries, but percentage-wise, a higher advantage for people with lower income.
That's right, yeah.
Working people. Okay, and then there was 1.5%, 1.5 mils of property tax taken off of all property. It's not a huge amount, but that went to all property owners. So homeowners would get some. And the exemption of the first $75,000 of a person's home from the 20 mils of school tax.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the income side, the personal exemption and standard deduction were more than doubled, so that people earn more money now before they start to pay income tax. And so that went from a 3-tier system to essentially a 2-tier system. The top tier were the major earners. That was reduced, and that did benefit those with higher income. Now, that and a few other tax breaks put in there are going to reduce taxation about $1 billion, and most of that goes to working class people. Is there any projection of what that will do to the Kansas score that we were showing, where we're actually on a decline? Is that going to move the needle, or is there going to be a need for other policy?
No, yes, that'll move the needle. That's the problem with some of these studies where it's 2 years old, right? So we got to wait for data to come in. And so that's why 23 is the most recent. It'll come out in October, I think. Early October is when the new data comes out. So we'll see 24 only then. But the answer to your question is yes, that'll help those scores. So Kansas did some positive things there in terms of increasing economic freedom.
And then before you ask your second question, if I can just answer a bit of that, is oftentimes folks roughly stated love what we would typically call Republican tax policy, and they love what we would call Democratic spending policy, right? And if all you're doing is cutting this one tax over here so we can ultimately raise a tax over here, that doesn't really do us a lot of good. I mean, maybe there's an economic argument whereby, you know, you don't want to tax work, or you don't want to tax capital, you know, whatever those cases may be, you want to tax consumption, some of these kinds of things. If you don't have the wherewithal to actually constrain spending, which was something that was baked into some of these different scores, and at the state level where you can't print money like the feds can, right? If we don't have the political will at the state level or the county level or the city level to actually constrain spending, then it is wonderful that we are cutting, you know, this $1 billion worth of taxes that you referenced. But in 2, 3, 5, 10 years, if we just have to raise taxes somewhere else because we don't have the fortitude to constrain spending, then it will have all been for none.
My second question would have to do with the spending side. You know, it was mentioned that Kansas has a rather rapidly growing per capita spend for in the state budget, and but when we look at that, you know, 48%, it was to over 50, goes to K-12 education, which in 2019, the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that they would decide how much was an appropriate education, K-12 education, and required not only increased spending, but over time, or continued increase of spending. And if it wasn't for declining enrollment, we would be way up into the 50% of our budget going to K-12. Okay, and then you add to that, 12% goes to higher education. And we all know the cost of higher education is going up rather rapidly, much higher than the inflation rate. And so that is a hard place to start cutting money. And then 30% now goes to human services, which the majority of that goes to our public health system, or Medicaid. So when you look at that, those three categories, K-12, higher ed, and human services, is 90% of our budget. So what kind of public policy do we need if we are going to constrain state spending, or and along with that, you know, we've got a rather high percentage of the people who are employed by the state, but in a state with stable declining population, what kind of public policy are we going to need if we're going to improve our score with this?
Let me make a couple quick comments. So the numbers here, it is spending as a fraction of your income. So if the income grows because the taxes, and maybe we've made Kansas an affordable place, and people, you know, feel like this is, you know, better than some other states or something, and we actually have a little bit of growth, or at least we're stabilized, then that spending will improve. As income goes up, if spending stays the same, then the score goes up. So it is relative to that. So some of these things end up being combined together. The problem is it takes time. So these are long-term things, and then maybe the next politician comes in and the policy changes again or something. So,
right. Two things. One, on the public policy, right? With every dollar that goes out of any government coffer, right, there's a constituency that comes with that doesn't want to see that ever get cut. So it's a very real political problem for any politician of any party at any level of government to say, I'm actually going to cut spending. And I don't want to suggest that that's not the case. I think there are opportunities to cut. You know, in K-12 education, up until I think this last legislative session, there was no auditing on which kiddos were eligible for at-risk spending, which is supposed to be a plus additional money that's spent on behalf of kiddos who, you know, maybe English isn't their first language, or they're eligible for free lunch, or they have a learning disability or something like this. There's very little to no auditing of that. So there are opportunities, but I'm not suggesting that they're easy. What we've talked about over a number of years that we publish, you'll forgive the shameless plug, is our Responsible Kansas budget, which holds future increases in spending to inflation and population growth. So you're not necessarily cutting spending. You are simply saying it will not increase by anything more than this level, because just because government, quote unquote, needs more money doesn't mean that I have more capacity to pay higher taxes to finance it. So that's part of it. It's putting in these rules. Colorado, which is, notoriously a state that a couple of decades ago everybody in this room would have considered a red state, a very conservative state, and now maybe we think of it as, they have legalized marijuana, a variety of other different things, right? That it's this purple to blue state. Economically, they're still rock solid on a lot of things because they have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which makes it almost impossible to increase taxes. Right? It is a constitutional provision that says you cannot increase taxes at the state level without a very overwhelming vote of the public, and that's part of what allows Colorado to grow like it has. And then to your point about government employment, we're the 48th most governed state in the country. If you think about what that means, it means that we have only 2 states are worse than us when it comes to state, local, and federal employees in the state of Kansas per resident. The other ones are also plain states. And it gets into this idea, right? It's Dakota, one of the Dakotas, I cannot remember which one, and I believe it's Wyoming. And it's because you have these states that have existed for 100 odd years. Kansas came into the Union in 1861, and we have slowly been, again, relative to the rest of the country, losing population because of things like mechanization on the farm and whatnot. But we still have all of the townships, all of the water districts, cemetery districts, library boards, like all of these different things that each have a couple of employees and each have the ability to tax. And lest somebody watching this recording or anybody in here recoil at that, I'm not necessarily talking about consolidation, right? But it's just, do we actually need all of those things, or can we consolidate them in county government or in a municipal government or something like that? Yes,
One side thing
Oh,
first. Colorado, I didn't know that part might be due to it. One of the few states that didn't subsidize the Broncos' new stadium, and it was all privately funded. So there's one example of, you don't have to give money to these, billionaire owners and teams that are generating this. It is possible to do a stadium and not lose your team.
Right.
Lauren.
Yes, my question goes back to the economic freedom of states. So with the country, you kind of saw a consistent correlation between the wealth of states of countries and their freedom. But within the ranking of states, I thought very interesting that West Virginia and New York were ranked very similarly. What are some, with those being one of the richest states, one of the poorest states in the country, what are some policies, examples that may go into that becoming, those that, them being so closely ranked? Are they different policies that having the same thing and different reactions?
So government spending and taxes as a fraction of the overall income of the state. West Virginia is actually a very poor state in terms of income, but they still have services and government spending that needs to be done, and so they kind of end up having a larger fraction and ended up getting knocked down for that reason. That's probably most of West Virginia's story. New York, on the other hand, has very high income, but then also proportionately high government spending and taxes to match. And so that's probably the story behind what's going on at the state level with those.
Anything much to add?
Yep.
Yeah, so this may be a slight rabbit trail, but in the beginning you were talking about tariffs and their negative effects. So I was just wondering, do you think that all tariffs are bad? Because I know they're unconstitutional unless they're for paying debt. But do you think even those tariffs should be allowed?
Short answer, yes, all tariffs are bad. The world would be a much better place if we had 0 tariffs around the world. I think we should be free to, so the single most thing that has taken 30%, reduced poverty by 30% in the last 30 years has been opening up borders. All international aid programs in large part have done nothing, or even worse, just went into the pockets of the corrupt officials. And so those transfer programs have not worked. What's worked is opening up to markets. Let these poor countries sell stuff to rich Americans, and that's how poverty's been reduced by 30% by opening markets. And that's through lowering tariffs, lowering other trade restrictions. So yeah, I'm very much a zero tariff around the world. I thought Trump was maybe the mastermind negotiator, that this was the bluster, I'm going to tell them 100%, and then they're going to run for the hills, and then they're going to go to zero, and we're going to go to zero, and at the end of the day, the world's going to have zero tariffs everywhere. That doesn't look like it's shaken out like I was hoping. I had various fractions on the probability of that happening, and it's not good now. Yeah. So
A couple that's an interesting. You said they were unconstitutional. What are you referring to?
Yeah, so in the Constitution, and I might be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure it says that like tariffs for like paying off government debt are legal, but anything other is unconstitutional.
I'm not familiar with that.
I have my pocket constitution, but it's in my it's in my briefcase. I'm that guy, right? I walk around with the pocket constitution. I do a dramatic reading of the Declaration every Independence Day with my kids. They love me. I'm great at parties, okay? But I say all of that to say that I left it in my car, so I don't actually have it with me. That on some level, that doesn't sound right, but I'm not going to say that you're wrong. What I will say is in this most recent U.S. Supreme Court term, they struck down some of the different tariffs that Trump had implemented, largely because of the authority that he was claiming to use to implement these tariffs, and that's why they struck them down.
It was unconstitutional in the sense of how he implemented them. With the stroke of a pen, he put them in place. That was unconstitutional. So I don't know if there'd be something there, maybe
passing.
Right. But then for the first, I'm just going to use round numbers, 125 years of our country, Congress was allowed to levy tariffs. And one of the reasons that now that authority has moved to the United States Trade Representative in the executive branch is because it was absolutely ripe with corruption. Because every industry went to Congress and said, we're special, give us a break, or increase this tariff on this other person. So if you read about Gilded Age American history, for again, any of those really neat people who need something to fall asleep to at night, right? When you hear about corruption, like after the Civil War, before 1900, it was largely because of this tariff process, whereby industries were going to Congress asking for increases on steel from this country or grain from that country or what have you, because they were seeking special treatment. So the thought was that by moving that to the executive branch, it would lower the opportunity for corruption. And I would also just say, the United States doesn't buy cars from Japan, right? James Franco, buys a Toyota from Toyota, right? These are not countries that are exchanging, these are individuals, right? Many of you all in this room, again, it sounds like, are coming to the United States to achieve your dreams of getting a degree, playing sports, fostering your economic opportunity, because that's what you want to do, right? It's not countries doing these things, it's individuals acting in what they perceive as their own separate interest. So again, it's not the United States buying, a car from Germany. It's me aspiring to buy a BMW, right? Or something like that, right? It's a very different thing than countries engaging in this kind of trade.
I had a conversation that was with a guy that shipped fish from all over the world to like Bonefish and Outback Steakhouse and whatever. He was like a supplier. And we got into this tariff talk, and he said, since Trump started that, 30% of his time now of his job is just tracking things, changing things, making sure they're following rules. They actually were suing the government. They're part of a large lawsuit that I think they're going to win. That now they had it got real murky though, because their suppliers lowered the price a little bit. He got into the details. I'm like, gosh, what a mess this is compared to just buying fish from another place, right? And so that's just an example of how the government really muddied up the exchange system through that one single policy with maybe good intentions. Those are the worst kind, to help Americans and make America great again, but has disastrous consequences in the long run. And we're still going to be feeling that for a while, by the way. Once that shook, they changed their whole business plan around, and now even if it unwinds tomorrow, they're still got these implications because they stopped getting things from the Philippines and they shifted over to Indonesia, and so those things just don't change overnight again. So let's see, who else hasn't? Janet, you haven't gone yet.
Since you touched Germany, so I'm from Germany, Felix is from Germany. Do we as international students, since we're here like temporarily, obviously there is opportunity to stay here longer,
Right.
but do we have somewhat of an influence for Kansas to get pushed up again, like economically or like business-wise? Like, what kind of influence do we internationals have?
Let me ask you a question. Do you mean like public policy wise, or do you mean like economically?
Getting a job.
Probably both.
Both. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
We love your German money.
right.
We love you converting euros and paying your tuition at Ottawa University.
Right.
No, it's a big bonus, is in short. So.
Right. One of my favorite restaurants is in Wichita. It's by a German immigrant. It's
Yeah.
Prost. It's wonderful. Very good Jaeger Schnitzel. And really, really good beer. For those of you who are 21 or over and care to indulge in such things. Just not driving afterwards. So on one hand, not knowing your voting status or what have you,
Yeah.
right? The ability to influence public policy, quite frankly, might be something less.
Yeah.
But behind all of these numbers that Professor McCullough was talking about and that I'm kind of alluding to, is there's a human behind each one of those, right? And some of America's most successful businesses, some of our most successful people have been immigrants, right? The people who founded Google, Carnegie was from Scotland, right? And they may have had different, warts in their personal lives or what all these different kinds of things, but we should be fostering a system where people want to come here, go to the wonderful universities and higher or different kinds of educational environments we have, and then choose to stay here because we have these kinds of economic opportunities. There's trade-offs in anything, so you're saying goodbye to your family for a number of years or what have you, right? But it's the idea of like we should be welcoming these people who are doing a fundamentally entrepreneurial act of wanting to come to this country legally so that they can engage in what they think is their American dream. And we should be a place as a country or as a state that makes it easier for those people so that if you all decide you don't want to move back to Germany or some other third country or what have you, that you can stay here and think that this is a place where I want to raise my family. This is a place where I can achieve my version of the American dream, maybe easier here than you could back home.
Yeah, I mean, Milton Friedman once said, why would you ever turn down free assets? Like if somebody wants to come work here, why would you turn it down? Now the answer ends up being because of our welfare system and getting on, the system that with transfer payments. So it's hard to have both in place if they're, taking transfer payments from the system the way it's designed. So the dirty little secret in the United States for the longest time has been, we have an open border with illegals coming over because guess what? They can't get those transfer payments in. They just have to go to work. And so that's been kind of the thing that's not said very much. That's kind of worked well for the United States. And of course, now we're turning that upside down with tightening those things. Yeah, we don't want to get sidetracked on that. Are we about done?
Yeah, I see one more.
Yeah, we got a couple minutes, and I want to do a little giveaway with. Did
Okay.
you number those? Okay.
I
Yeah,
didn't
I just want to
know
go
that.
back a bit. I checked my pocket constitution.
Okay.
All right.
Article 1,
Nicely
Section
done.
8 says the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and exercise to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. So that sounds to me like
That's you just said Congress at the beginning of that, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
So
That's
they
the
give
part
the
we were talking
parents
about. Yeah.
Just to pay their debt.
No.
Is that what that means?
But
No,
Congress
keep-
has to do it.
Well, Congress has to do it, but then
Right.
keep reading. So collect debts, national defense.
Pay the debts and provide for the common defense, general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and exercises shall be uniform throughout the United States.
Right. So you can use it to pay national debts, which says something about where we were when the Constitution was ratified, where we had debt from the Revolutionary War, and at the state level we were consolidating those things. And at that point we did not have an income tax. So, but it is the second and third that allow for those revenues from tariffs or taxes or duties or what have you to be used for other things. And it is amazing what courts and Congress have read into the clause where you said general welfare. So, yes, they can use it to pay for debts, but they can also use it to pay for national defense, so more tanks and bombs and planes and things that go boom. And then also for the general welfare, right? That's what it said?
Yeah.
Right, so general welfare is food stamps for people who maybe need a little bit of extra help, Medicare for older Americans, crop subsidies for farmers, all of these different things fall into that general welfare bucket. See, now, this is the difference between you having your pocket constitution on a device and me actually having a printed one, which says something about my age, staring down the barrel of 45, and your age not being that.